This is my first piece of 3D printable terrain for my game Spire Seas, or at least the first full prototype. And though it might seem like a pretty simple little box, it has easily caused me the most headaches and taken the most time out of everything I've designed so far. Because, you see, this terrain has a little bit of a secret. The idea here seemed simple. I wanted to make a set of 3D printable, modular, vertical terrain for my miniature game that could double as a carrying case for the miniatures and any of the pieces I might need to play. Unfortunately, this has taken up most of my time for the past month and a half or so, and I'm still not really even completely finished yet. But I think I've finally gotten it to a point where I can show all of you. Now, if you're new to the channel, let me explain a little bit about the game. It's a miniature skirmish game set in a post-apocalyptic future, where crews of scavengers ride out on little boats to reclaim salvaged material from the flooded buildings of an old ancient city. Critically, it's designed to be pretty small. It's usually played on a 2-foot by 2-foot board, and to balance that, the terrain is therefore vertical. Now, I've made some vertical terrain before, mostly from scratch, and it was pretty fun. It was really exciting to build, and I think it turned out pretty cool. But there are some problems with it. You see, that terrain is not very easy to transport, and it doesn't always fit the scenarios that I want to play. So as much as I like looking at it and love using it, it's not always the best thing to use in my game. And since I want my game to be as accessible as possible, I wanted to try using my relatively mediocre skills at Blender to put something together that I could take anywhere and anyone could use. The first step was to make a few mock-ups in Blender to get a general sense of the shape and size that I would need to actually make this work. Now, I had actually been planning this for a few months before I ever got started, so I had a good sense of what I was trying to do, but I really wasn't quite sure exactly how many models I could fit in each box, how big each box needed to be, or what the actual shape of the box would have to be to fit on a 3D printer. This turned out to be a lot more complicated than I thought it would be. I played around with various shapes and orientations, all while trying to keep in mind the general size of a 3D printer and the internal space and stackability of the object. My original idea was to have a single stack, which could fit the miniatures, the cards that are used to play, and the boats themselves, probably split into 2 parts. But as it turns out, that wasn't very practical. Basically, since each unit would need to be able to reach the roof from the base, and in my game Spire Seas, I use a playing card for measurement, that meant that I had a vertical height limit for each block. Something right about there. I used my own 3D printer to set the horizontal limit, and since I needed to actually fit a playing card inside the terrain, that gave me a kind of minimum unit of measurement as well, both vertically and horizontally. And it's pretty tight. While trying to determine the overall dimensions of the block, I also had to figure out how they would physically fit together. My original plan was to just have a little indent on each corner, but eventually I realized that this would mean no blocks could link together. They would always have to be just a single stack of blocks. I don't know if I'm explaining that properly, but I think you can kind of get what I mean seeing it here on the screen. Basically, I needed to redesign it so that I would have some variation in the way that blocks fit together. Eventually, after a lot of just fiddling around with blocks in Blender and scratching my head at how everything was supposed to work, I did settle on a set size. This block here is 100 millimeters long and 75 millimeters wide. Therefore, it's a 4:3 ratio. This means that two blocks can actually fit together with a little bit of an overhang, meaning that it's not always going to be just straight edges. And I wasn't really sure about it at the time, but after getting these printed, I am pretty confident that these little nubs, though they are pretty short, are actually enough to catch and make sure that these pieces don't slide around too much during play. That said, there was one problem, which is it doesn't really look like the roof of a building. First, I tried to solve this by just creating a pattern on the roof that would look kind of like a tiled rooftop, but also would fit locked into the piece above it, but it kind of just didn't look very good. So I scrapped that plan. Fortunately, it didn't take me too long to realize that since I would have a fourth block that was mostly empty, I had some storage space to put some little fiddly bits. And that meant I could add something extra on top of the roof to make it look better once the spire was actually built. So I started designing these little roof panels. These have the dual function of both providing a more aesthetically appealing surface to play on and look at, while also kind of locking in the other blocks. One of the downsides with this design is that if the top block is on the corner, although it locks on two of the sides, the other two don't really have anything to keep it in place, so it can kind of rotate freely. But by adding in a little roof panel, then I can kind of lock that rotation a little bit, or just enough to keep it stable during play. I also ended up making two different sizes, a half width and a quarter width, I guess, which means that pretty much any orientation you put these blocks together in, there's a way to make those roof tiles fit. Mostly. Pretty much. 99%, 80% of the time. So with those basic pieces all set, I spent a little bit of time just kind of adding some designs to the outside. Mostly just bevels around the edges to make everything look a little cleaner, and these interesting little side panels to make the building look more building-y. And it's not as sci-fi as I intended it to be, but I do think it makes it look at least a little more visually interesting than just basic boxes. That said, these designs are not set in stone, so if you have any suggestions or ideas about what the side panels should actually look like, then feel free to drop those down below. I might end up making a more brick or cobblestone version as well, but that seemed like future Trevor problems. So for now, this was good enough for a prototype. So with the externals pretty much finished, it was finally time to start working on what really set this terrain apart, the internal storage system. In my mind, this was a pretty simple endeavor. Just add a little scaffolding structure, something to make sure it doesn't slide out the bottom, and there you go. But in the end, getting the details of this system right took up basically 60-70% of the time on this project. The challenge here is making sure that something will mechanically fit with the rest of the system, but also be pretty easy to 3D print on a resin printer. And resin printing has some unique challenges. The most important thing is that any overhangs you have are going to need to be supported. You can get away with about a 45-degree angle, something like that, but not much more than that. And even then, it's kind of pushing it. The other thing is that as you build up horizontal space on your build plate, that also builds up pressure on each pull of your print. So big, flat pieces like this are not actually that easy to print out. Trying to account for all of these different factors while designing the tray became quite a bit of a challenge, but once I settled on a basic design, something that utilized those 45-degree angles to make most of it support-free, I quickly started making progress on it. In the end, I settled on this design with the deck of cards positioned in the middle, which left enough space on either side for little roof panels. There was one small problem with that though. The roof panels themselves, being half the size of the actual box, would wiggle around quite a bit if they were just left to hang out in the tray. That meant that any paint or details applied to them would quickly get worn off in transit. So I ended up making little baby trays to go inside the tray to fit the roof panels, if that makes sense. These definitely add a little bit of weight to the box itself, but I think it's worth it to know that each panel is nice and secure, and to keep it from just wiggling around inside. The only thing I have to worry about is this tray falling out of the bottom, and that's where these little keys come in. I realized that by just popping a little pin into something, I could prevent that tray from sliding out the bottom, and if I made that pin itself look kind of like a piece of the terrain, then it would be pretty fine, I guess. Originally, I maybe went a little overboard and designed a semi-round keyhole that you actually put a key in and rotated, just to really make sure it didn't come out. Eventually that felt like just too much work. And I don't know why I thought that anyone would want to really lock down their terrain pieces. So I decided to eventually change the design to just a simple little plug that you could fit in. With those finished, I basically had one full set ready to print out and try in real life. And this is where my headaches truly began. Now, from here, the rest of this project basically becomes just a series of minor tweaks and adjustments, changes, additions, mistakes, headaches, and I don't think either of us really have the patience to go through all of that in detail. Besides, somewhere along the way, I kind of stopped recording. So instead, I'm just going to quickly cover all of the steps that brought me from here to here. First, I printed out a test piece of the shell and the tray, but it's a little wonky and kind of too tight. So I thinned out the walls and printed the top separately. This turned out better, but still kind of wonky in a different way. I also changed the pegs to diamond shaped so they would actually print. I realized I was being an idiot, trying to print everything flat on the build plate. So I changed the supports. Still a bit wonky. So I sanded it down, jammed it together. Not perfect, but good enough. I redesigned the tray to work for miniatures. This one I also split into two parts. It worked great, to my surprise. I then printed roof panels. These also turned out great. Most of the time. Honestly, I think there might have been an earthquake during one of my prints. Either that or my cat hit the printer. I don't know. Finally, I printed the pegs, but they're too big. So I adjusted the size. Too small. So I readjusted the size. Still too small. I questioned my choices and my hubris for printing out 12 pins each time. All of them the wrong size. I hung out with my cat a little bit to calm down. Finally, I printed out the correct size of the last piece, fit it in, and everything worked perfectly. And now, after much trial and error, I present to you the prototype Spire Block. This finally fits together, at least in an acceptable way. And with it, I can test out things like how well my blocks stack together, or whether the trays actually fit inside correctly. And they do. This is a functional prototype. It's definitely not perfect. As you can see, the roof panels fit on here mostly snugly, and each of these can also hold some miniatures or cards and the roof panels themselves. Plus, it can lock in a variety of different configurations. So you can put multiples together into a nice little spire structure for your games of Spire Seas, or whatever else you'd like to play. Now, the Spire Block is already available to download and print yourself on myminifactory.com. Link down in the description below. But keep in mind that it is very much a prototype. Though the basic block is done, I still have some work to do on the double blocks, the blocks meant for holding your actual ship inside. Those are going to require a little more work, and I'd like to get any feedback about the design before I invest too much time into those. That said, rest assured that if you get yourself a set of these blocks, then the larger ones will be added at some point in the future. Now, as for the actual game of Spire Seas and how these are going to fit in, well, I already had the chance to test it out. The other week, my friend Nick joined me once again for a quick test game of Spire Seas using this new terrain, and it worked surprisingly well. I was kind of nervous about using my wonky little test prints for it, but turns out that I didn't need to be. For now, these function just as any other terrain in the game, but I'm also going to be adding some special rules for how to use them. And finally, if you want to be a part of designing those rules, or just stop by for some relaxing hobby time, then join me on my first live stream next weekend. Since this is my first time trying something like this, nothing is quite set in stone. But if everything goes well, then I'm looking forward to trying some live hobby time as well as live 3D sculpting every other week or so. Keep an eye out on the channel for when that goes live, or check it out after the fact. In the meantime, you can check out more about the rules to Spire Seas right over here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.